Hey everyone, this is Nick from Annex Plants. In this video, I'm going to be going through and doing a bit of a question and answer. So we're going to start, I think I'm just going to go through the questions. First one I got was about this Wenlinger I mounted in a previous video. It's doing completely fine. It snapped its most recent leaf because I didn't water it enough. But other than that, it's completely fine. It's just rooted out this pole. It hasn't started to do the aggressive sizing yet, but I think it's just a matter of it establishing itself more. Yeah, super easy. It's definitely fine drying out pretty dramatically. The roots haven't really seemed to be affected. I think it's a decent alternative to growing them in a pot. I don't know if it's, I don't think it's been as fast as it was for me starting this one originally in Pon. But by putting it onto one of these and hanging it, it allows me to put plants in a spot I wouldn't normally have them. So it's definitely not the worst thing. I got a couple questions about plants and ambient and sort of what I do. There really isn't anything special. I just take the plant out of the tent and put it on a shelf. I don't do any sort of acclimation or anything like that. What determines whether or not I bring it out is the state of the plant and its size and the species, etc. There's some plants that I would never consider bringing out of the tent. And then there's others where I don't really care. I'd say one of the big things is if it has an emergent, do not take it out of the tent, especially the big emergents that are almost hard, but still a little bit floppy. Those plants seem to handle the transition the worst, and I think it's just because that emergent leaf will just dump too much water. Here's my Papilamenum RA6. This guy is living in ambient. You can see flower, no problem. It's got a new leaf on the way. And this plant, I literally just took it out of the tent and threw it on a shelf in ambient. And if you can hear the background noise, that's the air conditioner, which means this apartment is, the air is pretty dry in it. It's right now, we're probably at the hottest, most humid time of year, and it's maybe 50% humidity indoors. And this plant was handling as low as in the teens. Yeah, it's just more about selecting a healthy plant. And I think the big thing is maintaining the moisture around the root ball. And since it's in a self-watering pot, that's automatically done for me. And then sometimes if you do move an anthurium into conditions it doesn't like, but it can tolerate, your first 2, 3, 4 leaves even can be a little bit decrepit until it fully adapts. A big thing you'll notice if you drop the humidity is your leaf size will shrink quite a bit. For some species like red crystals, and other ones that can actually accentuate the color. So there are definitely some upsides, but by and large, the plants can handle ambient. Just make sure they're. The way I like to think about the plant care is you can usually do one thing wrong. So since these are very, and let me expand upon that. So if you're moving it out into low humidity, like on a shelf, that is your one thing wrong you get to do. So you need to make sure you are adequately fertilizing, giving the plant good light, you don't let it go dry, all those things, because in the low humidity, your margin for error is a lot smaller. And as far as like species and selection, everyone's experience with plants is going to be a little bit different. There are very few anthurium I would not attempt in ambient. Those are primarily the ones that already have a really bad reputation. So think Debilis, Splendidum, those sorts of ones, where even a tent humidity is not necessarily enough for them to be very happy. I think if you have great success growing a plant in a tent, and you want to move it out, especially if it's large and established, you can give it a try. The worst thing that'll happen is you need to move it back to the tent. Obviously don't throw a sensitive plant out on your shelf and then go to bed. If you are nervous about this is something that you should observe over the course of hours. See if the plant looks to be wilting, if the color starts to go, if any of those edges begin going very translucent. Those are all signs that the plant is very unhappy. And make sure wherever you're moving it to has somewhat stable conditions. Like if you live in somewhere where extreme temperatures or whatnot can come through your windows or whatever, don't have it by an open window. As far as that goes, I'd be willing to try most hybrids. And again, if the plant isn't happy in a tent because the humidity isn't high enough, probably don't attempt it in room humidity. Yeah, So far I've moved out, I've yet to have a plant have an issue. And the reason I discovered this is I was, last winter I was having some issues with plants in the tent, and I was pissed off at a couple plants, so I just left them in my kitchen on the floor overnight. And they went straight from the tent to the kitchen floor, and no acclimation, and they didn't show any signs of stress many days later. So I just kept experimenting with it, and I really think the trick is maintaining that moisture in the root ball. My next question is about offsets, and it says, I heard offsets can be a sign of stress. And I would say I have very few plants that have ever offset. This one was one of them. It offset when it was in very rough shape. This leaf is actually growing off the offset. From my understanding, that offsetting is definitely can be a sign of stress. However, some plants do like to offset more than others, and some hybrids, some whatever, are specifically known for offsetting. Think the JV Red Velvet, Voodoo Child. Those ones are both known for offsetting. Then we have a species or specimens, whatever you want to call them, like the clumping Bessiae that SKG sells, where you have a species or a plant that was collected from the wild that seems to exhibit this peculiar desire to offset rather than grow from its primary growth point. If your plant is offsetting to the point of ill health, I would definitely, potentially seek out intervention. But if the plant just throws one offset and is otherwise doing all right, I wouldn't really worry about it. It's more just a free prop. Okay, and I said this plant offset when it was very stressed out. It's since no longer offsets. It hasn't done an offset since. Did the one, I'm pretty happy with that. And both the main plant and the offset are healthy, so really no worries here. Okay, next question is, would I ever consider doing a video on silica? I feel like my nutrient solution video covers it. Maybe if I get into making the short form content, I would do a specific video on silica. But I definitely think it's one of those nutrients where if you're looking to level up your growing, it can make a huge improvement in the health of your plants. And it also it increases their resilience to pests, stress, and a whole bunch of other things. And I think if you want to move into growing some more complicated or delicate varieties, it can make a huge difference. However, if you're considering doing silica, don't even bother until you are comfortable with pH adjusting. Silica without adequate and necessary pH adjustment is worse than no silica. So before you do the silica, become comfortable testing your pH, applying a product like pH Down, and then once you add the silica into that mixture, you need to make sure you are pH adjusting it below 7. If you're doing silica and you're not pH adjusting, do not do the silica. And if you're looking to start out with getting into the silica and you don't want to add it directly to your nutrient solution, starting with silica as a foliar feed is always a good option. And it's in fact the way that a lot of manufacturers recommend you apply silica. So that still requires a pH adjustment in order to keep it in the absorbable form. However, you don't have to do all the other things in a nutrient solution line. You could just add the silica into a spray bottle, pH adjust it, and then foliar feed. So that's just mixing it onto the leaves of the plant. In my experience, it helps a lot with the warping of emergent leaves. And I think that's like the most obvious noticeable thing. Certain species, certain plants in my collection, I can notice the difference when I'm feeding silica versus not feeding silica, just in the shape of the leaf. And then in my propagation and seedling bins, I can notice effects of not providing adequate nutrition, and one of those things being silica, because certain plants will react very poorly to its absence and become much more difficult to care for. I got a question about how do I balance plant care with other commitments in life. Very fortunate that I share the hobby with my partner, so we both take on plant care. The other thing is we've gone through a lot of effort and trial and error in order to minimize the amount of daily maintenance the plants require. So a big thing is we water once a month. And I know if you're stuck in if you're managing a large collection yourself, that probably sounds crazy. However, it's watering once a month due to the sort of wick and reservoir style of pot, it makes it very easy. So we usually just have a couple days a month where we mix up all the nutrient solution we need, and then we go through and just zone by zone pull out the plants, dump the reservoirs, flush them, and then refill them. And you're able to work through the plants pretty quickly, so it doesn't take too much for us to do it that way. And the other great thing is if you miss, if your watering days or whatever gets delayed, we can go very easily 6-8 weeks without any sort of catastrophic outcome. And then for the little bit of plants we have that aren't in the reservoir style of pot, once every 2-3 weeks, all I have to do is go through with a misting wand and mist the seedlings, the small plants I'm growing out, because those are the only ones that aren't in the reservoir style of pot. So with that, it really leaves the plant care as mostly like the fun stuff, like the repotting, the props, etc. And I feel like we often are looking for more stuff to do with the plants, because we have a free evening and there's nothing to be watered or whatnot. So I find we often look for things we can do, like repots or whatever. I would say it definitely hasn't become too much to manage yet. I think we definitely felt like when we had less than 100 plants and we were still doing things like, I'd say, like more the traditional way with like your chunky aeroid mix and watering and all that, we had, I feel like, way more work than with the number of plants we have now. Yeah, so my big tips would be, if you're primarily a tropical grower, really figure out a way to, one, affordably make a potting medium that can handle a reservoir style of pot, and then figure out a way with the supplies you have available to you to make really cheap but reusable reservoir style pots, whether that's the cutting those like 32-ounce food containers to fit the little net pot, or nesting the net pots. Like I've seen so many people doing the reservoir style of pot. There's a million ways to do it. I just think it makes a huge difference in reducing the amount of care you have to deal with. And then other than that, I'd say just keeping lists of things that you want to get done in your plant hobby. Like we often have a list of repots, like the pot they're currently in, the pot they need, and that way we can track our repots, because if we realize we need more, because we're often playing like musical pots essentially with this style of pot, and it's the one size down that we use. So if we know we want to move some seedlings into the smaller square reservoir pot, and we don't have any free square reservoir pots of the smaller size, that means we need to up pot some from that size to the next size up. So if we make a list, we can track all that stuff, and that makes it so that when we sit down to do the plant chores, where we have what we need lined up, it saves us from overbuying the pots. Then I got a question about Carla substrate mixes. Got a cute little Carla here. This is one of the ones I repotted recently. So I keep all but one of my Carla in my DIY pond, which is 4 parts perlite, 2 parts pumice, 2 parts black lava rock, and 1 part fluval stratum. And since I have it right now, I do mix those 4 parts perlite. 2 parts are number 2 and 2 parts are number 4 perlite. You don't need the chunkier perlite. I just did it because I have access to it. But before this most recent purchase of perlite, I did not have it. So that really doesn't matter to the mix at all. And yeah, so whenever I say pon, I'm really referring to my DIY of that recipe. I don't use Lechuzapon, and I have never used Lechuzapon beyond the little bits I got in plants I received from other people. I like my mix. It's a lot lighter than regular pon, and for me it's a very affordable solution, and it works great with plants of all types. So I grow my baobab in it, I grow ferns in it, I grow anthurium in it, I grow cactus in it. It doesn't really matter. It's just about how you water it, since it provides the sort of like perfectly moist, perfectly airy environment for roots. I know a lot of people say Carla don't like the wet feet. I think don't mix up wet feet with a perched water table. If you're sitting them in sort of a layer of water and that water line is able to rise up in the pot, very few anthurium like that. Most of the hardier ones will tolerate it. However, with Carla, they have very thick roots and they don't tend to like to be in that super wet environment. So I think the biggest thing I would do is make sure that you have separation between the water and the substrate. That way it can't sort of supersaturate that bottom layer. So then I got a question, set up for self-watering versus set up for a pot with leca with a tray. So I think that's asking the difference between if I plant in a pot like this. This is just a container I use to rinse leca, but it's one of those like style pots that I use pretty frequently, just in a larger size. And then I'm assuming something like this. So either way I pot in here or I pot in there, I'm gonna put a leca layer that's a couple balls deep. I think that just keeps everything a little bit clearer and less muddy at the bottom. I think it also makes it easier to tell where the water is sometimes. Like in this very small pots like this that are like this big, I don't do a leca layer. And in the wick pots, that wick will then come up over the layer of leca. I should just keep holding this. So in a pot like that, the wick will come up and it'll sit on top of the layer of leca, and then I work in the substrate, the wick into that bottom layer of substrate. And then in pots without it, that leca will obviously serve to soak up and distribute the water evenly into the substrate above it. I think the pros for the non-wick pot setup is the cost. This style of orchid pot, or whatever you want to call it, they're very affordable, and you can mass order thousands of them at a great price from Alibaba. The downside is you have to potentially water them. With the bigger pots, you can definitely leave a little bit of water at the bottom of the tray, no problem. But I think, in my experience, the smaller pots, that starts to become a bit more of a problem. And if you are leaving water in the trays, at least for me, that led to a lot of cyanobacteria, which is just a pain in the ass to deal with. Yeah, I think biggest difference is cost. I think those white square pots I showed you with the reservoir, they range between $10 and $20 Canadian per pot, whereas even buying them from a reseller, those sort of matte finished plastic pots cost between 10 cents and $1.50. Another downside to the reservoir style versus the orchid pot is it's very easy to just sell a plant in the orchid pot. You don't have to repot it or anything. Obviously, I think I prefer the wick pot just because it makes care really easy, and not having to worry about watering is lovely. I got a question about caring for Anthurium clarinervium. I think the big thing people need to recognize about Anthurium clarinervium and a lot of these other hardier, and especially the Mexican species, is they a lot of them are lithophytic, which means they grow on rock in nature. So that's going to change a little bit of how you care for them. They're not going to be as tolerant of anaerobic conditions in their root ball or the constant access to moisture. So something like the clarinervium, I find a lot of people that I talk to have success allowing it to achieve a true dry cycle. So if that's in moss, you let the moss go fully hydrophobic. If if you're in pond or these other things, like water it like soil, but then allow it to go dry as if it were a cactus. And I think if you are an underwatered and you want one Anthurium that you should not learn care on, but you just want an Anthurium in your house, the clarinervium is a great option. Their leaves stay pretty small, but you can give them a nice big pot. And I think the big thing with them is don't overthink it and don't treat them the way you would treat a Panamanian species. Got a question about yellow edges on Warocqueanum. I'd love to pull down my queen. That is just not happening today. I've got a nice big emergent, and that plant is also really, really heavy. If you're struggling with your Warocqueanum, I think my biggest points of advice would be the appearance of their leaves is tied very closely to the happiness of the plant. And I think that's true for all Anthurium, but queen are very quick to show you any sort of little issues. It can be as simple as the presence of too much chlorine or chloramine in your water. It could be slight underwatering, slight overwatering. You could have touched it. And by touched it, I mean disturbed its roots. Really anything will set off the queens. In my experience, they're hard to kill, but they're very hard to make happy. I think my proudest Warocqueanum moment was when it had 3 leaves without yellowing edges. But of course, the oldest leaves were still yellowing those edges. So my advice, I think, would be if you're chasing that perfect Warocqueanum, to leave on those old ugly leaves for as long as possible, because they seem to protect from the newer leaves yellowing. So I noticed, like, as soon as you remove those older leaves, the next oldest leaf is going to start yellowing. So try and keep as many of them on, and then, keep it happy, keep it fed, keep it under good light. They want a lot more light than some of these other Anthurium, and not necessarily want. They can handle a lot more light than some of these other Anthurium without bleaching out. So definitely, especially if your queen is growing very, very slowly, and by that I mean less than 2 leaves, 3 leaves a year, I would definitely up the light, and that's on a full-size queen, not on the small ones. The small ones you should get a leaf every couple months. Yeah, dial up the light, make sure the feed is there, and if you're going for perfect appearances, leave on those older yellowing leaves. Okay, the next question I got was quirks of care for Cuneolense and Dressleri. Okay, let's start with Cuneolense. I think my biggest piece of advice for anyone attempting to grow Cuneo who's struggling is get it into a self-watering pot ASAP. From what my conversations with growers in hotter, drier climates, the biggest struggle they have is keeping up with its water demands in summer and countering the summer sort of die-off they get. I think the best way to do that is to just give it access to as much water as it could possibly want by giving it a self-watering pot with a decent reservoir. I think that will solve a lot of your issues. If you've done those things and you're still having problems, I know they are very sensitive plants. This is where something like silica can come in and help. A big thing silica does is it strengthens the cell walls, and something Cuneolents struggle with is very sensitive leaves to touch, to changes in conditions, to things being sprayed on them. All those things can cause those Cuneolents, especially those emergents, to really just melt. So, if you've done everything and you're missing silica, try that. If you've done everything including silica and you haven't done self-watering, give the self-watering a try. I think if you live in a place where the heat just gets too much, there might be limits on what Anthurium species you can grow. I personally don't have experience growing in that level of temperature, as I live in the Pacific Northwest, and when it's hot out, I run air conditioning. Okay, and then quirks of care for Dressleri. I think the biggest thing with Dressleri is you just need patience. Not that Cuneolents are any different, but the Dressleri, they can be slow to mature, and they can be slow to flower. If I'm remembering the article I read on Exotic Exporter, it's 3 to 4 years from seed to flower for a good Dressleri, which is just a lot slower than most of the other Cardiolonchium that we grow. I have plants that go from seed to flower in under a year, and I think Dressleri just aren't a species that does that, so I don't think we should expect that result from them. And then as far as quirks of care, I think outside of highly inbred selfed lineages, the care is a lot easier, and the care for any overly inbred selfed lineage is going to be a little bit more challenging because that plant is going to have less resilience. I get a lot of questions about the grow lights I use. Right now I have pretty much everything under the 10 watt Barina, I want to say T5s. If I said the wrong product name, I will insert it. But that's what you see, on all these shelves in here, in either of these grow tents. The only other lights I use are this one Fluval 40 watt planted 3.0, if you know the Fluval product lines. I had that from my aquarium days. Personally, it's you're paying about the same as you'd pay for any high-end LED light in the plant world, but it comes with like a really relatively straightforward to control app with inbuilt timers and whatnot, so you can adjust the level of each color of light, all those different things. If you like doing that, it's a good light, but again, pretty expensive, and I had it from my aquarium days. One nice thing is it is, I don't know if they call it waterproof, but water resistant. Like, it's designed to be able to be dropped into a fish tank without dying or frying your fish. And as someone growing in elevated humidity, it is nice having that extra peace of mind that this light was designed for wet, humid environments. And then the other light I have is another like 40-watt grow bar that I use above my Monstera. And either that 40-watt grow bar I was just talking about now or the Fluval on its max output both put about 2,500 to 3,500 foot candles up close to them. And I like that for my Monstera and my other plants that I want to give closer to that full light experience, although 2,500 to 3,500 foot candles is nowhere near that full sun. I find it's just enough that some of the dwarf trees and whatnot I grow get enough light to be healthy. Someone asked to see Magbivep. It's hideous and tucked away. Swapped out my one of my props for my main plant, and the main plant has been chopped up, so there really isn't anything to see right now. Okay, this is a really interesting question about anthurium flowers. So it's why some flowers go receptive but don't produce pollen, and why some flowers produce pollen but don't go receptive. I find certain species in particular to be very difficult to catch when they're receptive. I think a big one I've been struggling with recently is my Carla Blackiae. I have two outside of my 5x10, and both of those ones I have managed to miss every single time they've gone receptive. With something like a Carla, you have to look a lot closer to when it begins to release the spathe. Not all anthurium species will also produce that much stigmatic fluid to the point where it's visible. Something like some of my Bessiaea, I have to put a light up to them and look for any little bit of reflectiveness in on the specific, on the flowers. And then plants that won't produce pollen, I genuinely think some plants won't produce pollen in the quantities necessary to do anything. A good example of that is my Hobgoblin. It's huge, it's produced babies, it just makes so little pollen that I don't think I could do anything with it. Maybe I could rub its inflow on another inflow, but even that, you're asking yourself, is this dust, or is this one little patch of the inflow producing pollen? And that just isn't enough to bother collecting or even trying anything with. Another example of a plant that doesn't really produce pollen for me is my Rhodolantianum. Collected quite a few flowers on it, pollinated it, and it just does not make a usable amount of pollen. I get very little amounts. And it sort of varies. Some plants produce very little pollen. Some species produce very little pollen. Some species produce tons of pollen. There's too many factors to go into answering why a specific specimen may or may not produce pollen. I think it's just tied with virility. And sometimes when you hybridize a plant, you lose virility, and sometimes you gain it. And some species are just, more fertile or more willing to do those sorts of things, and others just aren't. So if you have a plant, outside of these edge cases, let's talk about what happens if you have a plant that should not be the case for. So if your plant isn't producing pollen and it isn't going receptive, and it isn't a matter of you just missing the receptivity or the receptive window, I think you need to look at sort of what care issues could be the root cause of this, because if the plant isn't healthy, it's not going to perform at its peak. So that means you won't get as many berries, you might not get pollen, you might not get it to go receptive. So you gotta ask yourself, did it miss a watering? Did it not get fed? Because all of those things will impact its fertility. There are certain rumors about compounds that could be added to reservoirs to induce extra pollen. I've talked a little bit about this with a local hydroponic growing expert, and he had some ideas, but he doesn't have experience with anthurium. You got to ask yourself, what could be preventing the plant from being at its optimum? And when it comes to breeding, that is often what is preventing you from having success. The plant just needs a little bit better, whether it's conditions, care, whatever it is. I've also noticed if you have the inflow in the path of a fan, you might miss that stigmatic fluid just because the inflow isn't producing enough to counteract the drying effect of the fan. And then for pollen, just make sure you're feeding your plant. And I think the bigger problem is some plants will produce pollen while being receptive. And this is a given for any anthurium. There's always going to be a risk of self-pollination because that's just something that can happen. And there's always going to be a risk of cross-pollination, unintentional cross-pollination, because obviously a lot of us are intending to cross-pollinate. I've been trying to weigh this as someone who has started to sell a little bit. I asked myself what I would do in that situation. Because if you sell a batch of seeds and it turns out they weren't what you advertised them as, that's obviously a big problem as a seller. But it's something that seems to happen, and it's almost like an eventuality with any grower, because there is only so much you can do to prevent cross-contamination, and there's nothing you can do to prevent self-pollination. I think a good example of this I have is my Delta Force X Self. It was sold to me as a Delta Force crossed with a Lux. However, I purchased it believing it to be a Delta Force Self because I've grown enough Lux hybrids to be able to recognize when a plant does not have any Lux in it. I think you see this often with Warocqueanum hybrids. If a plant has Warocqueanum in it, it'll be obvious from the first leaf. And if it's, let's be clear, if this is crossed with Cardiolonchium, because that's what I am most familiar with, you will be able to tell from the first leaf whether or not there's Warocqueanum in it. So if it's the father, and it doesn't look like a Warocqueanum, there's probably not Warocqueanum in it. If there's Lux in the mix, and there's no visible Lux in the hybrid, probably didn't take with Lux. So as you get more comfortable and begin understanding how these hybrids play out and which species tend to be dominant in hybrids, you'll start to notice more and more examples of just accidentally contaminated batches. And a big thing is the entire batch might not be contaminated. With a compound flower, it is possible for multiple parents to be present on multiple fathers to be on the same infructescence. Okay, I got a question asking if I could do a video identifying different nutrient deficiencies. I think the biggest problem I'd have with this is accurate color representation on camera and being able to communicate incredibly subtle differences. I think the best thing I would recommend if you were trying to do this is you have to learn it for yourself, and you have to learn it for your plants. No one knows your plants better than you, and no one knows your eyes and yourself better than you. And I think it's a process that involves touch, smell, sight, all those things. So you need to learn for yourself. I think a good place to start is identifying gaps in your nutrients and then seeing how those come up on, or seeing how that presents itself in different anthurium. I think one of the most obvious deficiencies in anthurium to begin with and begin identifying is a magnesium deficiency. And this is going to roll into, I think, the topic that I probably get the most pushback on, and that is the necessity of CalMag with fertilizing anthurium. Anthurium are different from most other species of commonly grown plants, and they require a ton more magnesium, a truly ridiculous amount of magnesium. If you look at a dry weight analysis of anthurium tissues, you will see that magnesium makes up a greater percentage of their tissue by weight than nitrogen. And most fertilizers just cannot take that into account because most species do not require that level of magnesium supplementation. So I think if you are not supplementing with magnesium in one form or another, there are a million ways to supplement magnesium, including directly into your substrate. You're going to have a chlorosis of the tissues. And your plants just won't be as dark as they could be. So if you begin then supplementing with CalMag added to your routine, and you notice the differences in your leaf appearance, very closely look at how the color changed, how the texture of the leaf changed, all those things, and that's how you're going to begin training yourself to recognize deficiencies in plants. Now, once you have you've developed an increasingly complex routine and you're noticing fewer and fewer deficiency issues, that's when you start to get into the fine tuning, and it's really not necessary from there. It's just about being able to grow 90% of your plants really well, and then having those few plants that push you to be better, to learn more, to expand your care. Yeah, I think start by looking at your current feed routine, noticing the gaps, and then plug those gaps and see how it affects the appearances of your plants, and then learn from those changes. I got a question about my bucket setup. So that's in the 3 and 5 gallon standard size bucket. Something you get at any hardware store. In it fits this net pot that comes from hydroponic suppliers. This one is from Future Harvest Development. That is the company. I believe many companies make this, but this just fits on the standard bucket. Its external measurement is 12 inches and the internal measurement is 10 inches. So 10 inches, 12 inches. And then into these I cut a couple things so I can feed a nylon rope through. And that wicks from the reservoir that sits in the bucket. Yeah, that's all there is to it. And you just pick the 3 or the 5 gallon based off of how big you want that root ball. And the root ball will actually build itself using this net as a structure. And it'll exist more in the humid air. It'll also be in the pot absorbing the nutrients, but it'll be, the root ball will hang out there. You can potentially begin to encounter problems if those roots then enter the reservoir. So that's where the 5 gallon bucket comes in instead of the 3 gallon bucket. Other than that, it's just a net pot in a bucket. My price from my local store, I pay $6 for that net pot I showed you, and I pay $6 for the nice black bucket. And then it costs me about $2 for the nylon rope that I feed through to make the wick. And it just makes a huge net pot setup. Next question is about Anthurium lineages and their breeders. I think if you're getting into Anthurium, probably the 2 biggest names to know are J. vanini, or JV, and Rory Antelope, or RA. RA is also the one that the Antelocii is named after. And there's a million other, like Fred Muller, Carla Black, all these, if you know your species well, you'll recognize a lot of these names. Tim Anderson, he's frequently abbreviated TA. And the big, as far as lineages go, the only names that matter are the lineages, or the names or lineages that matter are the ones that you can trace back to the original collectors. And that's just for tracing the level of inbreeding, but also if you can't trace a plant back to the collector and the person who did the species identification, and it's not that plant that was specifically identified, it's by and large a trust game as to the provenance and the purity of that specimen. That's why a lot of Anthurium people are very particular with their lineages and where their plants come from. I'm not looking to start the conversation on poaching or what counts as poaching or where these plants are sourced from. I personally own plants from Ecuadorian nurseries, and I also own plants from Rory and J. vanini. And I'm not encouraging people to purchase plants from poachers or mass poaching events. I'm just a hobbyist who enjoys collecting plants and wants to collect plants in a way that is the most sustainable for the hobby in the long term. Okay, I got asked to show the whole tent setup. I will just quickly go over the products I'm using since I'm in front of the tents here. This arm is in one tent, this arm is in the other tent. They are both 4x4, so 4 feet by 4 feet by 8 feet tall. I'm very fortunate this apartment has 8-foot ceilings, and these tents just fit on the ceiling. I like the little bit of extra height. That is made possible because these are the Gorilla Grow. I can't remember what they call it. It's like the professional series or something, and those ones come with lifts, so you can pretty much stack 1-foot lifts as much as you want. I only have the space to do one, and that's just, it's kind of nice. It lets me get almost an extra shelf of height out of the space. And then in them I just have those, everyone has them for sort of industrial applications, those stainless steel shelves with the adjustable heights. And then the 10-watt burrito bars, like I said. Nothing to it. I like the Gorilla Grow tents. They're They're nice, they're good quality. If you're looking to buy a tent, I definitely recommend checking out Marketplace. You can get tents for a great deal. I bought my first Gorilla Grow tent off Marketplace and I paid, a fraction of retail. Then I did buy my second one new. That's just because I wanted to exactly match for this space. What else? What other products do that? Oh, I should say I use AC Infinity fans connected to an AC Infinity controller. The one I use here is the 69 Bluetooth, very basic. In my new tent setup that I'm going to do at the other place, I got the fancier Wi-Fi controller so I can monitor that tent's conditions from my phone here at home. If you're living in the space, I definitely wouldn't recommend going anything beyond the basic Bluetooth. Relatively simple to set up the automations, and you can Google to figure it out. So then I have that connected to the AC Infinity fans. I run both tents off of one controller. However, each controller is only able to probe. They have like a temperature humidity probe, one tent. So I'm aware that these tents hold the same conditions, or this tent holds slightly better humidity. So I have the probe in this tent. I don't really need to know temperatures or humidity. The plants are in an air-conditioned space, and I've been growing in these tents for years, so I really know what they'll be like at any given moment. However, it is nice, and when you are setting up a new grow space, it's great having that detailed information. So that controller controls the two fans, and I bother with the controller and the fans, like I said, since I don't care about the temperature or the humidity, because that allows me to put the fans on a low speed for 20 minutes out of the hour every hour. And I find that just does a great job circulating the air without shaking things around too much. Okay, what could cause an emergent to turn black? I'm going to answer this in sort of two different ways because I think there's two versions of this question. One, it could be the plant just aborting that emergent. That can happen, I think, most frequently because the plant dried out. And you'll notice that happens when the leaf dies back partially down the petiole, shrivels to that point, and it really just falls off there. We still have some of the petiole left. If it rots all the way back into the plant, you've got a more serious problem. Definitely up-pot the plant if the root health is bad, and if it's not bad, you need to clean from where it died back to make sure that the rot doesn't go into the crown. The second, sort of less serious, but still you need to answer why it happened, is the emergent leaf will stunt at a small size, and it makes the prettiest leaves, don't get me wrong. The absolute prettiest leaves will be these like little stunted anthurium emergents that just never really get bigger than 25% or whatever of their final size. And that honestly is usually just a stress response, but not as serious as to cause it to die. I find it's often if the plant is, maybe you cut it when it had that emergent, or it somehow got separated from its access to moisture. That can be sick roots, it can be repotting, it can be chopping, it can be any of those things. So you got to ask yourself, go down the checklist, what happened, what did I do, what could have caused it? And if there's no explanation, and the roots are healthy, leave the plant be, and the next leaf is probably going to be fine. If you can figure out, if you can't figure out the explanation, the roots are bad, it's probably the roots are bad. There's so many things that can cause the stunted leaves, but if the plant's healthy, sometimes just appreciate the really pretty, sort of unique little leaf you get. Okay, next question I got is how long does it take for different anthurium to produce seeds? Fastest can be like 8 weeks. Other ones it's easily a year. It's just entirely species dependent. Within Cardiolunkium, it's usually about 4 months, but it's not set. You just have to experiment or look up what the species is. In crosses, I find it tends to favor the quicker barrier, but not perfectly. Like if you, like my hobgoblin and my Forgetii Lux both take about 5.5 months. That Hobgoblin is only a quarter Lux, and it's 3/4 Dressler, and Dressler is about a 4-month barrier. And my Forgetii Lux, which is 50% Lux, took the exact same time, and Forgetii are much quicker than 5.5 months. They're more like a 3 to 4 month barrier. So it really is just a bit of a crapshoot, and the best way to figure it out is to do it yourself. If you find your plants are taking longer than you believe they should or they have in the past, that is a sign of stress. If the plant is being bred back to back to back to back, it can begin taking longer and longer and longer for each harvest. And if the plant is just generally not as robust and healthy, it can take longer for the harvest. Fertilizers, I've talked about that at length in the fertilizer video. I think the biggest thing about fertilizers is just finding a brand that gives you the results you want. Don't constantly be swapping brands. They're all pretty much the same if you're looking at like crystals you dissolve in water or pellets or whatever. Like, you're going to get very little difference between brands, a bit of a different binding agent, but other than that, not much. And when you're getting into the multi-part hydroponic fertilizer lines, there are so many companies that provide roughly the same crude analysis as GrowTech or one of these other brands. So I recommend you just checking the back of the bottle and looking at the different ratios of nutrients. I started with the General Hydroponics. I switched off of that brand because I don't like who General Hydroponics is owned by. And if possible, I like to not spend my money with those companies. So that was my main driving force between switching away from General Hydro towards the GrowTech. And I recommend, if you can and you live in a country with the options to buy a local fertilizer company, but I know that's not an option for everyone. Yeah, and I talked about it a bit earlier. I think one of the biggest improvements you can make to your nutrient solution is adding a supplemental source of magnesium. And eventually, once you've dialed in that magnesium, you're going to want to dial in your sulfur, because that's the other nutrient that Anthurium require a lot more of than most other houseplants you're going to be growing. One of the big things you can do for pest prevention is clean and repot plants before they go into your collection. I don't know why people are so hung up on that bit of care advice. I don't know. I try to think of experienced growers I talk to and trade plants with, if really any of them would keep a plant in the mix it arrived in, unless you knew the grower well and they grew in very similar conditions. If you're bringing a plant home from the garden center or some of these shops, definitely give it a repot, give it a spray down, and move it into a growing medium you're comfortable in. Most of the time these plants are going to be coming in pure coir, which is great if you're a greenhouse in Florida. I'm not a greenhouse in Florida. I don't have direct tropical sun. I don't have the intense heat and humidity that would require me to grow in something like 100% coir, where it can really hold on to that moisture, but I can still water the plant daily. Your house is not the conditions that these plants were grown out in. And if you're trying to bring something in and acclimate it and get it into your house and happy, you don't want to start by giving it a potting mix and conditions that it can't be healthy in. And I really don't understand the desire for people to keep a plant in an unhealthy situation for several weeks in their house before they give the repot. You're just going to worsen the plant's state before you're going to do something stressful to it. It doesn't make sense. If you're dealing with plants outside of the Anthurium genus, I'm not talking about them. I don't know the particularities of every species, even within the genus. I do know that for me, what I do is repot when we get these plants. And it's just the easiest way to eliminate the pests, eliminate problems. You get to see the health of the roots, and a healthy plant is not going to throw a fit from being repotted. A healthy plant is going to throw a fit from all of its conditions changing without it receiving the adequate changes to its growing environment to compensate for that. And that just means, like, if you're leaving it in pure coir and then putting it under a weak grow light because you want dark foliage, or any of the other things, right? Just when the plant enters your care, treat it the way you want to treat your plants. Don't wait 2 weeks or whatever. Get the plant rehabbing. If the plant is so sick that you're scared about repotting it, you shouldn't have bought it. If the plant is so sick that you think a repot will kill it, you shouldn't leave it in the mix it came in then. It should be taken out of that mix, have its roots analyzed. If it has enough root to be repotted, put into a rehabbing medium. And if it doesn't have enough root to be repotted, then put it in water until it has enough root. Like, we know how to take care of our plants with our care methods in our environment. And unless the plant is coming from similar care methods in a similar environment, it needs to be given sort of the tools for success. And that's just sort of, I don't know, I always hear this shit. It's, don't repot your plant for 2 weeks. Don't repot your plant for 2 weeks. Oh my God, don't repot your fresh import. You're gonna kill it. It's like, no, you should be repotting these things and setting them up for success. Because if the plant is unhealthy or declining, that 2 weeks you leave it in your house is just going to put it in a worse position. Okay, and otherwise, let's get back to the pest prevention. So let's assume you're doing all that stuff. You can't be perfect because most of these pests that are annoying to deal with lay their eggs in the tissue of the plant. Mites, thrips, all that stuff, their eggs can last in the tissue of the plants for months. Months and months and months and months. And even if you don't see a pest, there are lots of these little microscopic mites that I think the anthurium hobby has been having to deal with recently. People call them flat mites. I sort of colloquially refer to them as flat mites. I'm not sure what the species is. So even if you can't see a pest, its eggs, or it could very well be there itself. So I always recommend hitting them with a comprehensive pest treatment. So for me, that looks like spraying something down with a spinosad spray. I'm trying to remember the active ingredient. I think it's called Endol. It kills mites. And then I apply a bonide. Bonide imidacloprid granules. So between those three chemical approaches, I should have my bases covered. And then I will usually put a plant in, sort of a smaller isolated environment near other plants that I am, a quarantine tent, if you will, or a quarantine shelf or a quarantine bin. Most of these pests will spread, so that isn't good, but it's not always the option to have a standalone tent that is perfectly environmentally controlled where you can put one plant in for 3 months while you study for pests. And I get that's not realistic. So I usually just have a space in my collection where I put the new plants. It's usually also a bit higher light, and I find that allows me to just catch anything coming off the plants. And I think recently I got to, for the first time, see and kill mealybugs. And they came off of a plant I purchased pretty recently. And it's not a big deal. There's nothing you can do to perfectly prevent pests in any way. And I had never seen one before. It's just so funny. This little puffy white thing was on one of my plants, and I just soaked it down in spinosad. Then I learned that isn't a good option for dealing with mealies, so applied the imidacloprid granules, and no more mealies. And that should, take care of any pests for quite a while. Don't be afraid of the pesticides. Research the necessary PPE and the sort of exposure guidance for you and any of your pets. Because here's a good example. Imidacloprid is the bonide granule active ingredient. It's the medication that's given to cats and dogs to treat fleas. And it's a soil bacteria extract. However, horrifically lethal to amphibians. So if you're an amphibian keeper, or if you keep any pets, you need to look up the pest preventions, chemicals, active ingredients effects on all life forms in your house. Children, pets, etc., etc., etc. And then again, obviously make sure you're wearing proper PPE whenever you're going to be handling any pesticides. And then here's the other thing. Just because a remedy is natural or an element or whatever, there's a whole time when people are doing the sulfur treatments on their plants. And that is so horribly dangerous for you and your health. So if you're going to do those sorts of approaches, really understand that just because something is natural doesn't mean it's safer. Okay, and then this naturally leads into the next question, which is systemics versus beneficials and the mix and using them for pests. I, for the longest time, did not like beneficials. I gave them a try for the last little while, just as an experiment to see if they could handle the mites, because I wanted to see if I could use imidacloprid plus the mite targeting beneficials to give myself the full range of protection, since one of the issues with mites is they don't eat deep enough into the plant tissue to get hit by the systemic pesticide efficiently. So I was curious to see if I could use the predatory mites that really just target mites, and then use the imidacloprid to handle everything else. I think they did an okay job, certainly keeping the population down. I don't know if they fully eradicated it, and I don't like the damage that the beneficial mites carcasses caused to my leaves, especially my emergent leaves. I got a lot of little spotty fungal damage from their corpses rotting. So if I'm going to have to take out my plants and spray them down anyway just to keep the mite carcasses off the leaves, I may as well spray them down with miticide. The mites are also the predatory mites were also very expensive, and I think I was getting 25 packs of the Californicus, and I was paying like over $100 with shipping each time, and they're according to the website, they last 2 weeks. I was using them for more like a month each, and very quickly you've spent $500 to get a few months of protection. And like I was saying earlier, these mite eggs can hatch for 3-4 months, up to 3 months really. And it's just, anytime you see a mite, are you going to spend $500, $600, $700 to treat? And I'm very fortunate that my plants are densely packed and they're mostly touching each other, so the mites are able to spread very efficiently. And just it's not necessarily a feasible option when a $10 bottle of spray is going to do a more efficient job. So I go back and forth. I at first I enjoyed the mites. It was fun watching them target and eat the things in the tent, but the carcasses on everything is just so annoying to deal with that I find myself still spraying down and wiping all the leaves. And if I'm going to do that, I think I will take a different approach. Team systemic, and especially I really like using spinosad as much as I possibly can, because I have cats and I am a mammal, so there's no real danger to exposure to spinosad to us. Okay, I got asked my favorite substrate for Anthurium, and it's definitely my DIY pond. I think it's my favorite substrate for everything. I love, I grow all sorts of plants in it, and I just adapt my watering to what the plant is looking for. Ferns, cacti, Anthurium, Philodendron monstera, I grow them all in the pond. I think if I've talked about this earlier, I finally figured out the issue I was having with some plants in my pond mix, and that was just, I was leaving too high of a perched water table. And now some Anthurium I fully grow, I water through the pond, let it drain, and then I just set it on a shelf, and that is how that Anthurium likes to grow. I've had great success growing my more temperamental species, like my Variozabalense, my Ceropellinense, and if I still had Clarinervium, I'd do Clarinervium. I don't have them anymore. I'm just not really interested in the clary. And that's made a huge difference. On the ones that I was having a little bit of rot issues with, moving them to the just free draining pond has been a game changer. Got a question about what do I do when seeds grow at a normal rate but the leaves don't size? I think, as a grower, when I get a full batch, it's easier for me to tell whether something is wrong with the specific plant or if it's just a runt. Sometimes the genetics just don't work out in a cross, and you get unlucky and that specific seed or seedling just isn't going to thrive. Other times they grow out of it. So if you really value the plant, let it grow. And if you have 100 other ones, maybe it isn't meant to be, and you can just chuck it and move on with your life. I got a question about Semihydra going funky and moldy. If it's mycelium, could be completely natural. If the plant is healthy, I would say ignore it. And if the plant isn't healthy, pull it out. And if you have it, do a Physand soak. But if there's mold, it's usually because there's an overabundance of organic material decaying. And if you know it's not coming from your plant and your mix doesn't contain organics, I'd be very curious. But if it's an organic mix, like a tree fern mix being kept in the semi-hydro, some ingredients don't hold up to the constant moisture. It isn't something I've really had to deal with outside of a bad batch of tree fern I got, which just was a lot wetter and moldier. It seemed to cause me maybe some issues with seeds and seedlings. I don't want to say it was necessarily tree fern. And some of my bigger plants that weren't ill affected, they had a bad case of mold or something growing in the pots, and I just sort of let the natural mold cycle take place, and then it's by and large been fine ever since. Sort of like what you have to deal with if you ever make terrariums or fish tank setups with lots of plants and other stuff. You just got to go and deal with the natural mold cycle as that outermost layer is consumed by the mold. If I could go anywhere in the world for a plant focused trip, where would I choose? And I think I'd go to the Darien Gap. Now I wouldn't actually want to go there, but I think it'd be fun. Obviously, if all of the reasons for not wanting to go there were resolved, I think if we're talking like for real, I'd probably have to do like Costa Rica or Brazil, just for the combination of comfort and pretty plants. Camera battery died, so I'm back. I got a question. Do LED grow lights lose performance over time? Yes, all lights do. And then this ties into the, get a lot of questions about the difference between the purpley pink lights versus the more natural colored lights. Only differences to you and I, the pink and the purpley lights are targeting the specific wavelengths of light that plants can absorb. And they're missing just the little bits that the human eye picks up and are unnecessary to the plants. So if you're running a monstrous industrial grow op, maybe you care about the few percent loss of electricity to the enjoyable frequencies of light, but to the plants it doesn't matter. Got questions about why I have my pH so low. I've since increased my pH a little bit. I target more around a 5 now. I was playing with it going lower and lower because in nature, in the specific regions that I like to collect plants from, they have very, very, very acidic pH soils, down into the 4s, which is why I was pH adjusting down to there. It's also within the manufacturer recommended pH range of my products, so if your product has a higher pH minimum from the manufacturer, definitely stick to that. I just was experimenting. The reason I dialed it back up is I'm trying to see how the higher pH, because different nutrients absorb better at different pHs. So I was targeting a lower pH to target certain nutrients. I've now dialed it up a little bit more to like a 5. I was doing like a 4.5, 4.8. So now I'm going up a little bit, and that's purely just to see how it affects things. I'm constantly dialing in things behind the scenes, and I usually don't tell you guys until I have 6 months to at least a year of experience behind it, because I would hate for anyone to rush into something trying to copy what I'm doing and have catastrophically bad results because I haven't had the time or the experience with the change. I got asked my PRs for lifts. I don't do anything fun like that. I just use the machines. Asked, have I been able to grow Splendidum in tent conditions? No, but I was able to grow Debilis in tent conditions. Once it hit caterpillar, I took it out of the tent because I want pretty pictures of it for when I breed with it. I got asked about acepox. Acepox, it's just a condition that some Anthurium seem to get, and Ace of Spades seems to be one of the more common ones, as well as Ace of Spades hybrids. I know the red vein DP also often exhibits it for people. In my experience, it's opportunistic fungal infections from a lack of adequate feed. And that sounds a little bit weird. I am assuming something in the comprehensive feed is necessary for some Anthurium to better mount an immune response. And I know that's a lot of gibberish that doesn't really say much. But if I have an Ace of Spades or an Ace of Spades hybrid that is prone to Ace Pox, and I cut off its access to my nutrient solution, or I reduce it too much, the Ace Pox comes back, and if I go back to properly feeding it, the Ace Pox goes away. I got some questions about if I notice differences between Anthurium and high light and low light. I think whenever you're going to be playing with light with your Anthurium, you're balancing growth speed versus appearance. I would never want to drop the light to the point where my plant isn't growing anymore. So I think the trick to balancing it is slowly reducing, not slowly reducing it, grow your plant healthy, get to understand it, then slowly walk it back from the light. Don't drop the light too fast, you can cause issues with root rot. But the big thing is, like, in general, the Anthurium take very, very little light. Light meter right here, so I'm going to just quickly... So right here, this plant's getting about 100, my Eastern Dressler right here, that giving this guy about 120 foot candles for most of the day, and then it drops to more like 40 to 50 for a few hours a day. And I find that to be perfectly fine. And then I have something like the Hobgoblin, which is up on a shelf. You guys can't see it. I'm not going to pull it out. It's, you know what it looks like. It's getting about 350 foot candles. So there's quite a big range you can play within, where the plants will still have really dark foliage, and you don't have to worry about killing them. If your plant isn't growing, or if it's struggling with root rot, probably too low of light. Definitely up that light. Oh, another thing, without enough light, inflows tend to abort. So if you have a plant that's otherwise healthy and it keeps aborting inflows, maybe try increasing the light. Gotta ask the next big thing in plants. I wish I could, look at a crystal ball and tell you that. I think, like within the Anthurium genus, there's so many traits that up until recently have been really, really rare and sought after, that through selective breeding can be improved upon. And I think we'll see a lot more of that in the next few years. Everyone's always like, oh, Anthurium are a fad, Anthurium are a trend. I think, like, all plants in general were a big trend and a bubble, if you will. But I think the thing that make Anthurium a little bit different is they just sort of do what humans tend to want a houseplant to do, which is look pretty in a pot and have big leaves. They don't require poles or anything complicated like that. And they really just make dark velvety leaves. And if that's what you like in a plant, you really can't beat them. Obviously some alocasia and some philodendron do the velvet leaves, but nothing does dark velvet leaves like an Anthurium. Asked how I treat root rot. I think the biggest thing with treating root rot is when you go to treat it, make sure you have solved the problem that was leading to the root rot, whether that was low light, improper temperature range, too moist, too dry, whatever it is. A lot of the time I find root rot is caused by either going too long without watering or over-watering and then continuing to do your normal watering. And the best way to treat it is to unpot the plant, get fresh media, clean off any of the root rot, and if it's really bad or it's gone into the stem, I recommend doing a soak with a product like Physan, and that's just going to target the mold, the fungus. It's not going to target the plant tissue. People recommend hydrogen peroxide. It can work okay in a pinch, but it's also going to damage the plant tissues, which could lead to further infection. So the best product is to use something like an antifungal and antibacterial. And obviously remove any rotten tissue and cut above where the rot is. I got asked about my pendant Anthurium care routine. I think the biggest difference with pendant Anthurium versus the other Anthurium is the pendant Anthurium tend to be fully epiphytic, whereas most of the common Anthuriums we collect are not fully epiphytic. They're hemiepiphytic or terrestrial. So with a fully epiphytic plant, one thing is going to be a little bit more tolerant of drying out. That's a really great thing if you're new to Anthurium care. And the second thing, this is specifically for pendants, not all epiphytic Anthurium, is in my experience the pendant Anthurium want and can handle a lot more light than the dark velvets, I recommend, 3-4 times as much light if you can manage it, but they're also completely fine with the 120 foot candles that you give, the 80 to 120 foot candles that you give your other anthurium. They're very easy to adapt. I think the thing you'll notice with especially Paldiflorum is it won't flower as prolifically if it isn't getting adequate light. I asked to do a chop and prop videos with updates. I am always chopping and propping. Usually there isn't much to see because I just take a bud off a plant and set it in a pot and it doesn't really react. I will see what I can do. What do I do outside of plants? I've got cats. I know, I like going to the gym, I like reading. Plants take up a pretty good chunk of my day. Obviously, I feel like my hobby within the plants, there's a lot of different aspects to it. At a certain point, playing the rare plant market is fun. Selling plants can be fun. Propping plants is fun. Breeding plants is fun. There's so many things to do within the plant hobby. But yeah, other than that, I'd say most of the time my other major hobbies are like reading and going to the gym. Oh, I also really like cooking, learning recipes and new techniques. Ask how long Corbin and I have been together. Almost 7 years. What is my favorite plant? I'll do this one. This is my favorite plant that I've bred. This is my Carla crossed with Nov DF. Really got to give this guy an up pot. It wants to flower desperately, but just a really pretty plant. Also kind of crazy dark. Favorite plant I bought is probably either Hobgoblin, Nov DF, Rhodolantianum, or that seed-grown Ace of Spades I have. But not that Ace of Spades. Definitely, I think it's probably between the Hobgoblin and the Nov DF. I just really like both those plants. Asked my electrical conductivity for seedlings. That's a concentration of nutrients. I tend to just give seedlings the same feed I give my mature plants, just much less frequently. If I were to build a customized feed routine for them, I would definitely leave out the bloom component and some of the other components of my feed that's targeted more at the adult size plants. However, I have not had issues feeding just my regular feed, and I tend to, with the small plants, target more of the foliage as I'm spraying, and that's just because I'm not worried about the hard water appearances on the small ones, and the small plants don't have as robust of a root system for nutrient uptake, so doing it through the foliage is a way to get a little bit more feed into them. Do not overfeed your small plants or you will fry them. That's just a big thing. Ideally, start feeding as they begin to show nutrient deficiency, and that's going to appear as yellow, not yellow, but like the green won't be as saturated. And if you're familiar with anthuriums, you know what I'm talking about. I got asked about my routine, if it's changing. I'd say the thing that has been most consistent in my routine for years and years and years now, even before I started YouTube, has been the substrate mix I use. I think my first time potting a tropical plant in a mix containing fluval was probably 10 years ago. Just because being in the aquarium hobby, I had lots of like dirty aquarium substrate, and that was a lot of fluval, so I would use it in there. And I really just built my pond mix from there by combining what I was doing in aquariums with sort of some DIY pond recipes I'd seen and tweaking them because I really didn't enjoy the recipes I'd found online. I found them too heavy. Other than that, I'm always changing. I'm always changing and tweaking my nutrient solution, my other conditions, just because, I don't know, the goal is always to marginally improve things. Big dramatic changes don't really happen anymore. It's usually, like, do I do 4 mils of bloom, 5 mils of grow, 5 mils of micro? Do I add a little bit more of this? Do I alternate using the root accelerator and not using it? Things like that. Just like minuscule changes to see if I can eliminate things or reduce the usage of things. You know, whether it's to save money, increase appearances, whatever. There's always reason to experiment. Ask the conditions of my grow tent. They're very consistently 85 to 95% humidity and in the low to mid 20s. Come winter, the low temps will hit the high teens. All of this is in centigrade. All of this is in Celsius. So come winter, usually 18. to 23, 24. And in summer, the low 20s is where it'll sit. And we don't really have the cooling off period at night. Other than that, the lights are on for a combined 12 hours a day. And if you're looking for the VPD, it tends to be between 0.005 and 0.3. Okay, and I got asked if I'm looking for a new genus for my collection. Probably not. I think right now, outside of Anthurium, the only thing I've been collecting is weirdly just like the odd, interesting, weird species. Yeah, my love is very much still primarily Anthurium. Okay, and then I got some more questions for a tent tour. I feel like I've shown tent tours, but I think what that means is when I set up my new tent at the new grow space, I will definitely, I think, film that process so you guys can get an idea of exactly when it went into it. Maybe what I should do is I should break down everything, like get all the receipts and stuff, and I'll make a full comprehensive video on what that setup entails. I think that's the last question. I really appreciate you guys watching here to the end. You always have such amazing questions, and it really helps me to stop and think and focus on sort of different aspects of the hobby that I might have missed when I share them here. So with that, have a really good rest of your day. Bye.